Hello, I'm Brandy Agerbeck of LooseTooth.com, and in this video I want to talk about listening. Go deep into listening and answer the two questions: how do you focus when you're listening, and how do you hold so much stuff in your head as you listen? This is absolutely a response to having just taught my virtual workshop, Visual Listening, which will become a video course. Early in the morning, or my morning of the virtual workshop, happily we had people all over the world. Early in the workshop, I asked people what they were there to learn, what their objectives were from the workshop. And two things came up in the chat, and I realized that yes, it did get answered over the course of the workshop, but I wanted to draw a more direct, straight line to answer those two questions. How do you keep your focus? How do you hold so much stuff in your head? So the first thing is, and this is going to be some repetition and recap for the folks who did join me live for visual listening, and this will be new to some folks who didn't join me. The first thing is, you are not a recording device. Now, I did start that day with that point, and I share it any chance I can, because I've recognized over time that so many people fall into this trap of treating themselves like a recording device. When they listen, they are listening for quantity. Now, my favorite symptom of this is, see if you relate to this. You were the star student. When a lecture started, you opened your laptop or you opened your notebook. I'm old enough to be from the notebook only era. And you opened up ready to take notes, and you took pages and pages of notes. But when you went back to that notebook or you opened up that file again, there was no real sense of personal experience or actual learning and understanding. And that is because you treated yourself like a recording device instead of a glorious human being who's there to learn, who's there to make meaning. So if you are one of those folks who relate to that, this can be tricky. This can be hard to unlearn that, because we have this sense that note-taking means quantity. But when you're in that mode of treating yourself like a recording device, you are listening for every single detail. You're listening to get all the phrasing correct. You're listening to get all the details down, and you're losing the opportunity to stop and listen as a human. To be listening for what are the main points. To be listening for how does this idea connect to this next idea. To be listening for really processing and understanding what you're hearing. So that's why there's that feeling of disconnect when you go back to those notes and you go, wow, I captured a lot, but I didn't necessarily learn. So number one thing, do not treat yourself like a recording device, because when you are there and present as a human and you stop and you listen and you let things come in, that is when you're able to make meaning for yourself. You're not simply getting everything down, but not letting it really sink in and connect and and really truly understand what you are hearing. Happily, we all have recording devices in our pockets. We have them on our computers. Let those recording devices do their job. You are there to be present as a whole human being. And this trap, this pitfall, happens both as an individual, if you're learning for yourself. I absolutely also see it in those of us who have roles where we're working for groups. We're there to help capture and make meaning for the group. And very often, especially if you're doing this job professionally, this is your income. You're getting hired by clients. There's this sense of, I have to get everything down, and that's what they're paying me for. And content is king. It's one of the very first huge points in my first book, The Graphic Facilitator's Guide. I am not dismissing content in the least. Simply that when we're going for pure quantity of capture, we're listening in a different way that doesn't help us really listen for meaning. So that's first point. You are not a recording device. You are a whole and glorious human being. The second idea that I wanted to make a more direct line to is this idea of prepping acoustics. Now, Anthony Weeks, my colleague and dear friend, was kind enough to join me for a conversation that we recorded for the folks in visual listening. And he brought up this idea of acoustics. Now, I've always thought of acoustics much more kind of mechanically around things like, is there enough soft surfaces in the room to absorb echoes? How, kind of the idea of an acoustically perfect concert hall, or the acoustics of things like recording devices. Am I able to pick up sound clearly? What I really treasured about this conversation with Anthony was he looks at acoustics much more broadly and more deeply. And we had this great conversation about external and internal acoustics and awareness of those acoustics. So let me explain. Now, yes, a big part of the external acoustics is more about what I just described, and that's making sure that you can hear and see easily. Now, my ears are covered up at the moment, but absolutely worth mentioning. Listening is not just about your ears, it's also about your eyeballs, it's also about your whole being and sensing and noticing. So where you can, changing the actual acoustics of the room. So my favorite example of this is how many times as a graphic facilitator, I get in early. I like to get there about 90 minutes before we begin so I can get set up and I can change any issues I might see in the room. And very often what'll happen is we'll be in what I like to call a mushroom farm. And those are those big hotel ballrooms, no windows, no natural light, thus the mushroom farm. And often there'll be spaces far larger than the group really needs. So what'll happen is I'll walk in and the tables and chairs will be kind of floating in the middle of the room. And in my role, where I'm very often taping paper to a wall, I'm just thinking about how all the sound and energy of this group is just going to float away into this massive room. So that's when I talk to clients and facilitators and say, okay, can we shift all of this furniture closer to the wall so we're creating a smaller room, a smaller space, a more intimate space within this large ballroom. And this isn't just for me. Yes, it absolutely helps me hear more clearly, see more clearly, but it also helps the participants. They don't feel like they're kind of, floating in this large space. They have a better sense of cohesion as a group. So that's an example of external acoustics. Are there ways you can change the room to make it more ideal? Sometimes what I'm doing is creating a setup where I might be blocking some outside sounds or nearby sounds. If I'm working on a freestanding board, can I move that board in a way that's going to block some sounds that I can't control, but I can kind of mitigate? So external acoustics, absolutely part of the equation. The next part of the acoustics are just good old anatomy. If you do have some hearing impairment, making sure you can see, so you've got both those channels working, sitting towards your good ear, if that's a factor for you. But for me, it's not so much about the ears, it's about auditory processing. It's the neurology. So for me, I gotta try to control those outside sounds as much as possible, which is exactly why I'm wearing these at the moment. So I'm not catching the fan. I'm not catching any sounds. I recorded this yesterday and had a bird chirping, which is not a bad sound. But, because I'm one of those people, the way my brain is wired, I absorb everything. I notice everything. It's very hard for me to filter out what it is I want to listen to and what I don't want to listen to. So, so as much as you can kind of, think about what do you need as far as your own anatomy, your own processing to help you succeed, help you focus, help you be able to hold more of that great information in your head. The third kind of category around acoustics, which we went into more detail in that conversation, was the internal acoustics. And I see this as, what is your relationship to three things? As an individual, as that glorious unique human being. What is your relationship to the objective? What are you listening for? Are you listening for your own learning? Are you excited about learning this particular thing? Is it math class and you're terrified of math, right? So first, what is your objective? What is your relationship to the objective of your learning? If you're supporting clients, are you connected and excited for what that group is there to do or what that individual is trying to do? So that's the first thing, is just what is your relationship to the objective? Is there a connection? Is there a disconnection? Is there a sense of flow? Is there a sense of tension? The second category is, what is your relationship to the content and the topic? So first is kind of the, what are you there to do, getting from point A to point B? The second is, what is the content or topic itself? And is it something that resonates? Is it something you have familiarity with? Is it something that's absolutely new? We are gorgeous pattern finding creatures, and we are constantly connecting to previous experiences. And for some of us, we really value novelty. So, you might have a meeting where you're thinking, I know nothing about this, and this is the most exciting thing. You might be going into a meeting where I know nothing about this, and I feel kind of lost because I don't have anything to connect this experience with. So again, being aware of your internal acoustics, your internal relationship to the topic, the content. And the third is, what is your relationship, your connection or disconnection? How do you relate to the individuals or the groups you're listening to? A huge part of this has to do with cultural context, cultural safety, power dynamics. What is your position? Is there privilege? Is there a lack of privilege? Certainly, do you relate to those folks in the room, or do you not relate to those people in the room? And throughout these three kind of categories of these internal acoustics, again, our brains being pattern finding machines does a whole heck of a lot for us, and it builds in a whole lot of assumptions. Now, we find those patterns, we connect to those patterns, we use those patterns to think faster, to make connections more quickly, to rely on previous information, and built into those patterns are a lot of assumptions made. So the big thing here is just to step back, get a little bit of distance, and look at what you're kind of going in, what patterns are you bringing into those experiences. And I'd like to say, try to use those patterns when they're working and let them go when they're not, so that you can be more present. So I don't want to go into a meeting thinking, oh, I've got this down. I've been in this kind of meeting 24 times before. I know exactly how it's going to go. Because when we do that, we're listening to reinforce the patterns of previous experience instead of truly being present in the moment. So again, look at your own individual acoustics. What is the environment? Is it working for you? Are there things you can change to make it more ideal? Again, for the ears, the eyes, and sensing as a whole person. Huge reason I love to have people on video in my virtual workshops is I can't be in the room with them, but the more I can see them and notice body language as I'm teaching, the more I'm able to connect and able to understand their experiences. External acoustics, certainly whatever you need as an individual as far as anatomy goes and neurology goes. And then again, when it comes to these more internal acoustics, relationship to the objective, relationship to the content or the topic, and relationship for the humans you are listening to. So all those things, all those awarenesses really help us be more primed to focus. We're eliminating or mitigating distractions where we can, and it's helping us kind of recognize, like, what exactly are we there to do, and are we ready for this topic, this group, whatever the specifics may be, so we can be more present. I think the more we prep in that way, which I really valued in this conversation with Anthony, the more we can prep in this way, the more present we can be. It really is showing up and being present as a whole human being. That's what helps us truly stay focused. That's what absolutely helps us hold more of that information in our heads. And a lot of it's the choice of making sure we're not inviting external distractions in. It just occurred to me right now, things like, kind of having a transition from what you were doing to what you're now doing, making sure you're putting up some beautiful boundaries around all the stuff outside in the world, your personal life, the wider world, the politics, if you're, within an organization and that's part of the equation, really thinking about what is outside of this listening experience and what needs to be inside this learning experience and not letting the outside stuff creep in. All of that helps us focus. All of that helps us be more present, be able to hold more in our head as we're listening. So the third point is very much around your mental bandwidth, which really is, it's mental, it's physical, it's emotional, it's all these things. But it is the idea of the more you have practiced, the more you can be present. Pretty sure the next video I'm going to record is going to go more in depth about learnable and practicable pieces of visual thinking or visual listening. But very briefly here, this is the idea that when you are doing visual thinking, sketchnoting, graphic facilitation, any kind of capturing visually with words, with images, with shapes, with arrows, with all that stuff, anytime you're doing this kind of work, you are making countless choices simultaneously. So you're thinking, how do I want to distill this idea? What size should it be? What color should it be? How does it relate to other things on the page? Where am I putting this on the page? And what does that tell me about how this new idea I'm capturing fits in with what's already there on the page? So there's all these choices we're making in how we're capturing something. There's also just the fact that, are we comfortable in our physical selves? Are we comfortable with the materials we're using? And certainly there's a lot of decisions around, or a lot of mental bandwidth with the listening and the watching and the noticing. Does somebody look unhappy? Does somebody look pleased? Are the folks getting it? Are they not getting it? All these things, right? That's a lot. This specifically being a graphic facilitator, that's my professional role I've had for 20 some years. Extremely gratifying, extremely intense. And so often people ask, like, how are you able to organize your charts so much? How are you able to synthesize? And it took me a long time to recognize a huge part of that answer is all the aspects of choice, all the micro choices, all these different skill sets within visual thinking that I have down, that I've got mastery in, that I've practiced so many times, I don't have to think about it. The muscle memory, the how much of my mental bandwidth is freed up because I have these principles, these techniques that I teach, which I love to teach, so that they aren't taking up that space in my head in that split second as I'm listening, as I'm processing, as I'm listening to learn and connect and understand. So for instance, one of my favorite examples is the trio, which is using, starting out with a color palette of 3 colors and knowing exactly what each of those 3 colors is going to do. So if I make those choices, 1, I'm not worried about, the 16 other markers or pens or whatever. 2, I'm not fiddling with a whole lot of different markers. 3, I have a very clear sense of, for the most part, what each of those colors functions is within the drawing I'm making. So I'm creating some patterns for myself, and I'm making sure that I'm open to be present and breaking those patterns if that's what best captures the content. So that's a very specific example where I have those choices so well practiced that they're not taking up any, or taking very little space up live. Like, they're just there. They're ready. They're ready to go. Now, this is exactly what I taught in visual listening live with the group and, in the subsequent video course. In the workshop, I was focusing on a very specific part of listening, which is, a very specific part of visual thinking. And that is what I call these spatial cues. So happily I was first able to really, think about my thinking and figure out how do I think, how do I listen, and how do I break it down into learnable pieces. So in the Acoustics method, day 17, I talk about these spatial cues. And what they are is getting attuned to the language cues, the transitions from one speaker to the next speaker, or if it's a single speaker, from one point to the next point. Language is absolutely embedded with all these beautiful bridges or transitions that help you understand exactly how the previous idea fits in with the next idea. And it was one of those things where it's something that, because of my past experiences, because of my strengths, because of, being very wired for spatial reasoning, it was something that came so naturally because it was something I was doing for so long that it was hard to remember, oh yeah, that is something that was learned and developed. So the great thing about the opportunity in the Acoustics method was surfacing, those things that were muscle memory to make them learnable, to make them practicable, if that's a word. And then to go even deeper into those 10 spatial cues or keys, we call them keys in the workshop, to go into even more depth during that deep dive day and in those subsequent video lessons. So again, all examples of when you break down a specific set of choices, learn what those choices are, have some guidelines. I don't want to say rules because rules get too stringent, they get limiting, but definitely have a sense of what are the principles behind these choices, what are some guidelines behind these choices, so that I don't have to think about them in the moment. That is point number 3. The more you can practice certain sets of choices, the more you can be present. The more focused you can be, the more you can hold in your head, because you aren't thinking, I'm worried about my penmanship is terrible. Practice your penmanship. Boring as heck, but totally practicable. You're not distracted by what color should this thing be, because you have a sense of, oh, if I'm going to make this particular kind of visual choice, like if I'm going to make connections between different ideas, I'm going to choose this lighter color so that it kind of recedes and creates more depth and doesn't kind of compete with the content. Examples here. You're going to practice those spatial cues, listening just for those spatial cues, so that when you're in that meeting and somebody says, so I've got a different angle on this. And that's one of those spatial cues that lets you know that the next thing that person's going to say may switch gears from what was just said, or may be a different detail or perspective on a main idea you have on that piece of paper. So all these choices, all these more specific skill sets and choices you can practice, the more you can really focus on that pattern finding, meaning making, connection making. All these glorious ways we show up as whole human beings with beautiful brains there to help make meaning, whether it's for yourself as an individual or when you are working on behalf of another individual or a group of people. And really, just the last point I want to make is these are all muscles. It is about muscle memory. It is about practice. It is about experience. The more experiences you build up, the bigger that beautiful knowledge base is, that beautiful internal library is, where you think, hey, I've seen this before. What can I use from what I've done before? I don't need to come at this brand new. I don't need to reinvent the wheel each time you start listening to something new. Now, yes, as we said earlier, we absolutely want to use those experiences, but also hold them lightly in a way to make sure that the present moment really calls for those experiences, and we're not just sort of doing what we've always done instead of really being present in the moment. How many times have I said present in this 24 minutes? 25 minutes. There you go. So those are some more direct lines between how do you focus, How do you hold so much in your head? Again, you are not a recording device. You are a glorious whole human being. Second, how can you prep this broader idea of acoustics? Be aware of your external surroundings, change what you can change, mitigate what you can mitigate. Again, think about what is it about your own physical body, the way you process information to help set you up for success. Third, what are the aspects of listening, visual thinking that you can learn and practice again and again and again, so that, as boring as some of that practice may be, so that you can be more present and you have more of that bandwidth, more of that mental energy open to really listening for meaning, finding those patterns, making those connections, making meaning as you're drawing. And again, not super sexy, but this is very much about practice, muscle memory, that these things are so embodied, they're so practiced, you don't even have to think about them. They become second nature. And that is how we make visual thinking, how we make the listening aspects, visual listening, part of this lifelong skill that we have no matter who we're listening to, what the objectives are, what it is we are there to do for ourselves or the people we're working with. So I hope there has been useful information in this about how to focus and how to hold more stuff in your head. Absolutely welcome you to check out loosetooth.com, because I love teaching those specific visual choices. That is why I am here, because I think this skill set of visual thinking is absolutely indispensable for yourself as a glorious individual and unique human, to reflect on your own experiences, to make meaning of your own experiences, to decide where is it you want to go next, make your plan for the next great thing. And absolutely for some of those roles we have where we're listening for other folks to help understand an individual, help that individual make positive change, and definitely for those roles where we are drawing in behalf of groups, whether it's more broadly as facilitators or team leaders, or if it's more specifically in the kind of role I've had the great pleasure of doing for 23-ish years of graphic facilitation or graphic recording. So please join me at loosetooth.com. Check out my books and my courses and my upcoming virtual workshops, because I love to teach this stuff to help you make meaning for yourself and the people you serve. So thank you for watching. I welcome any questions, and thank you for your time and attention.